Right, Zev?
Yeah, he's got his microphone off. That's why you can't hear him.
Okay. I'll start with our sponsors. The Year of Learning by Dr. Paul Koningsberg in memory of his brother, Dr. Sam Koningsberg, Shimon Reuven ben Weibush, and Ed Goldberg's cousin, Nisan Hara Nisan ben Fardosa. Paula and Bob Bromberg in memory of their dear friend, Julian Smith, Yehuda ben Yisrael. Malcolm Mann in memory of her family murdered in the Holocaust. Harav Tzvi Hirsch ben Shlomo Yaakov, Sarah bat Ephraim, Yisrael David ben Harav Tzvi Hirsch, Ephraim ben Harav Tzvi Hirsch, Adia bas Harav Tzvi Hirsch, Miriam bas Harav Tzvi Hirsch, Pesel bas Harav Tzvi Hirsch, Shalom ben Harav Tzvi Hirsch, Shlomo Yaakov ben Harav Tzvi Hirsch, Shmuel ben Harav Tzvi Hirsch. Many friends of Dr. Marvin Blush, Moshe Shalom ben Yitzchak Halevi, friends of Toby Paris, Sarah Tova bat Yisrael Dov, friends of Malka Levi, Malka bat Yosef, friends of Avi Gitler, Avram Meir ben Shimon, Cheryl Shur, her children and grandchildren, in memory of her uncle, founding member of BRS, Dr. Israel Brook, Yisrael ben Harav Akiva, Marcia Federbush and family, in memory of her husband, Dr. Oriel Paul Federbush, Oriel ben Harav Shimon. A Month of Learning by Haran and Mal Haller, in memory of her mother, Malka Rachel Bas Yehuda Leib, Adina and Michael Kirshner, in memory of their parents, Florence and Nathan Kirshner, and friend Harriet Friedman. Tova and Leo Zimmer, in memory of her mother, Henya Bas Rav Beryl, and her father, Aaron ben Yosef Mordechai. Perry and Jill Meltzer, in memory of his mother, Malka Bas Baruch, and his sister, Golda Leah Bas David Halevi. Carol and Josh Sanborn, in memory of her father, Yehoshua Shia ben Moshe Yehuda HaKohen. Stanley Presser, in memory of his mother, Leah Bas Yehuda, his mother-in-law, Golda Bas Avram, and his wife, Rachel Mincha Bas Moshe. A Week of Learning by Judy Iger, in memory of her mother, Bela Bat Anshel Yitzchak, as well as by Sherry and Moshe Gross, in memory of her mother, Miriam Bas Meir. And okay, that is actually it for today. And Shema's having Aliyah, Krank Rafia, Velti, Yeshira Shema Talia, L'chol B'nai Israel, a good Gaban Shtiyar.
Amen.
Okay. Okay. We said that this Perek Hamishi, deals with the aspects of the Korban Pesach itself, right? And that's what we saw discussed in some ways in Samach Gimel, Amud Aleph, and Beis. And so if we go to the bottom of Samach Gimel, Amud Beis, okay, to start this morning. Okay. I'm going to start about, about 5 lines up from the bottom. Okay. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Afatamid. Okay, when he said that not only if one has chametz in their possession, and did the Korban Pesach, it was not acceptable. He said the same thing applied to the Tamid. Amrulo, they said to him, Lo Amru Ela Pesach Bilvad. They only said that in regards to the Korban Pesach. Ematai, at what point? Bisman sheyesh l'shochet, o l'zorek, o l'echad mibnei chabura. Only when it's a situation that it was the slaughterer or the one who was sprinkling the Kohen or one of the people registered. Hayale echad b'sof ha'olam, but if it was somebody else, ein zakuklo, it doesn't apply to them. Ve'echad hashochet, ve'echad hazorek, ve'echad hamolek, ve'echad hamozeh, chayav. But this other Braita teaches that if one is the slaughterer, or one is the sprinkler, or one is the Kohen doing malika on a bird offering, or doing hamazeh, sprinkling the blood from the bird offering, okay, and he had leaven in his possession, chayav, then he would be obligated. In other words, okay, he's over, and therefore his korban is not acceptable. Aval hakometz et mincha, but one who does, Kohen, who is gathering up the mincha offering with his hand as part of the kamitza, eino over below ta'aseh, is not transgressing a lav. Furthermore, says the Gemara, hamaktir et ha'emurim, the Kohen who is offering up the specific pieces, the kidney, the fats, things like that we together call emurim, the sacrificial parts, eino over below ta'aseh, is not transgressing a lav. Okay. We get now to our daf samech daled, kasha malika amalika. Hold on, says the Gemara. There seems to be a problem between these two braitas. Okay, one says malika, you're not over, one says you are. Kasha haktara ahaktara. And likewise, there's a problem, okay, between the burning in one case and burning in another case. Ula ta'amech tikshelach hi gufa. And the Gemara continues to tell us, and even the language of the Braita, the second Braita in particular, is already problematic in and of itself. The Katani, because it said on the one hand, Lo amru ela b'Pesach bilvad, okay, that this seemed to only apply, this prohibition, regarding the Korban Pesach itself. Vahadar, and afterwards it comes and teaches us, Tani, Echad HaShochet, Ve'echad HaZorek, Ve'echad HaMolek, Ve'echad HaMozeh, that it applies to the slaughterer, to the sprinkler, to the person who does malika, to the person who's sprinkling the blood of the bird offering, which would seem to imply that therefore one is transgressing in all of those situations if they have chametz in possession, other kinds of offerings. Ela havaha Rabbi Shimon. But therefore it seems that we have to suggest that both braitas are statements by Rabbi Shimon. And so the Gemara says, Malika amalika lo kasha. How is that possible? That you could say the two different statements regarding malika, right? Severing the neck of the bird offering for chatat is not a problem. Kan ba'arba'asa, in one case, one braita applies to it being done on the 14th of Nisan, v'kan b'cholo shel moed, and the other applies during the intermediate days of the holiday. And the Gemara continues to say, ve'idi, and this one, this braita, and this braita, Rabbi Shimon he. They both seem to be the view of Rabbi Shimon. Okay? Now we get to the other aspect where we thought there was a kasha. Haktara ahaktara, nami lo kasha. The burning and the burning also doesn't seem to be problematic. Why? Tana'aihi, because this is a machloket Tanaim. De'ika demakish haktara l'shchita, because there is one Tana at least that makes an association between the burning and the slaughtering. Ve'ika man delo makish. And there is another Tana who doesn't make that hekesh, okay, that association between the two. Okay, so that's how we define that there's no problem between the two braitot. One saying that if one does their korban pesach on the 14th, only and has chametz in his possession, only then is it over alav. Okay? But it doesn't apply then to other offerings, versus the second statement, where if he does his korban pesach on Chol HaMoed, it's not considered a valid korban. So therefore, that's why he wouldn't be chayiv. But other korbanot that he might have, similar animals that would be shlomim, and he does have chometz in his possession, those would be held over on the lav. Now our Gemara wants to clarify, I would suggest, further. Rav Yehuda Omer, af hatamid chule. According to Rav Yehuda, even in the case of the tamid, okay? My tama de Rabbi Yehuda, what's Rabbi Yehuda's reasoning? Amar lach, he would tell us the follows. In one pasuk we say that it says zivchi, my offering. So what is that? Zevach hamiyuchad li. Hashem is saying it's one offering that is particularly special for me. Umay nihu, and which one is it? Tamid. It's the Tamid offering. Now, Rabbi Shimon Omer, what does he say? HaPesach ba'arba'a asar v'chulei. That Rabbi Shimon says it's regarding the Korban Pesach when it's offered on the 14th. Ma'itama de Rabbi Shimon, what's his view? What's his reasoning? Why? Because he takes the fact that there are two psukim, okay, close to one another, and each of them have the word zivchi in the pasuk. Okay, my offering is referred to twice. And what is he? Trei zimne. We have that phrase twice. And what he's going to do is a little bit more unique style of drasha. And that style is that you take what might be considered an extraneous letter from one word and you transfer it to another word. Okay? And that's what he's going to be doing here. Karebe, we read it zevach and zivchai. Okay, we take one yud from one, we apply it to the other, and now we have zevach, one word referring ideally to the Korban Pesach, and zivchai, my offerings, refer to other offerings. Okay, so he's transferring the letter yud from one word to another, from Pesach to the others. Lamai hilchata plagtihu rachmana mehadade. Right? So the Gemara asks, if that's the case, from what law do we see that the Kadosh Baruch Hu separated the letter, okay, from one case and applies it to another? Why didn't he simply write it in the outset, the word zivchai, my offerings? Lamemar bisman deika zevach comes to teach us that at the time when we have the offering, namely of the Korban Pesach, lo mechayev azivchai, one is not transgressing then having chometz and doing the offering regards to other offerings. On the other hand, bisman deleka zevach, on the time that we do not do the Korban Pesach appropriately, and one does other similar kinds of korbanos, okay? Say, for example, during Chol HaMoed, and he has leaven in his possession, mechayev azivchai, then one would be held obligated regarding those other offerings. In other words, chayev if he had the leaven in his possession. Okay, Gemara cites now another part of our Mishnah. Uboed, ubemoed lishmo, and when we say cholamoid for its intent, in other words, that the Korban Pesach during cholamoid is invalid, okay? Patur, he would be exempt, all right? Because it's not considered a valid korban, right? Tama d'shelo lishmo. Why? Because it's really not done for its intended purpose as a korban pesach, because if it's done then, that animal is considered a shlomim. Hastama patur. And therefore, in general, he would be exempt. Amai, why is that the case? Pesach b'sha'ar yemot hashana shlamim have. That an animal that is offered of that variety at other times, which would normally have been used for a korban pesach, in those other instances, it's considered a shlamim. Shamat mina, and therefore we learn from this situation, Pesach b'sha'ar yemot hashana ba'ei akira, that an animal that is slaughtered as a korban pesach the rest of the year needs specific dedication. It's uprooted, okay? And we have to specifically identify whether that animal is done for shlomim, okay, or for Pesach. Now, Amar Rabbi Chia bar Gamda says as follows: Nizraka mipi chavura. Okay, what do we have here? Okay, what happens if it? He's saying that from a group of the students, someone suggested the following idea. Va'amru, and they said, Kigon shahayu ba'alim t'ma'e mate, similar to a situation where if you have owners and they became owners of the animal and they bring the animal for an offering, but they have become tameh because of a corpse. V'nidchim lePesach sheni, and therefore their offering, okay, even though it may have been verbally designated as a Pesach offering, it has to be put off to Pesach Sheni. Desatme l'shum Pesach kai. Why? Because they, in general, had designated it as the variety for a Pesach offering. And that's his parallel to the necessity to particularly designate or explicitly designate the animal as to whether it's a shlamim or not. Okay? All right, we get to a new Mishnah. Right? Our new Mishnah is very interesting, and I bring it up because I think it's going to answer a question that Zev raised the other day. Zev raised the issue, Zev, correct me if I'm wrong, that what was done on the Mizbeach, and then weren't the people expected to bring their rest of their Pesach home and sort of roast it themselves? Was that the intent of your question, Zev?
Doesn't sound too familiar. I'm sorry, I don't remember.
Okay. All right. Well, I'm suggesting that that was part of the intent of your question. So this long Mishnah that we're going to see now talks about the process of what happened. Okay? And it may give us an answer to that issue. Okay. I don't see Erwin on this morning. Everything okay? All right. All right. Says the Mishnah, HaPesach nishchat b'shlosh kitot. That the Korban Pesach was slaughtered, okay? Remember, it was taken a few days earlier, right? On the 10th of the month. We just read that this past Shabbos, right? And then put aside, and then it was slaughtered on the 14th, okay? But it was done, says this Mishnah, in three, I'm going to call it groups for the moment. Shenamar, based on the pasuk, v'shachtu oto kol kahal adat Yisrael, and they darshan the pasuk kahal v'eda v'Yisrael, okay, as in three groups. So in other words, you needed to have three groups, either one after the other, okay, or all together to be able to slaughter the Korban Pesach. Nichnesa kat harishona, says the Mishnah. The first group, I'm going to say, entered. Nitmal'ah ha'azara, and they filled up the area of the temple precinct. Na'alu dlatot ha'azara. Then they closed or locked the doors of the inner temple precinct, okay, so that more people won't come in, okay. Tak'u, they blew tekiah on the shofar. Hariu, they blew tru'ah, okay. Koren calls it the uninterrupted. V'taku, and they blew tekiah again, okay. So they were doing this shofar sounds as they slaughtered the animals. What happened? Continuing, HaKohanim omdim shurot. The Kohanim stood in rows. Ubiyadehem beziche kesef ubeziche zahav. And in their hands were, I'm going to say, implements. They were sort of like ladles, okay? Bowls, but they had handles, okay? Some were of silver, some were of gold. Shura shekula kesef. One row with Kohanim holding silver implements. Kesef, they held that. V'shura shekula zahav. And another row of Kohanim that had golden implements, and they were gold. Lo hayu me'uravin, they did not mix. In other words, they didn't exchange implements, nor a Kohen with a gold one stood in the silver row, or vice versa. Velo hayu levizichin shulayim. And these implements, okay, these ladles, and that's why I'm using the term, okay, did not have a flat surface at the bottom. They were more somewhat pointed. Koren actually has a picture of what they think they looked like. Okay? Shema yenichum vayikresh hadam. Lest the Kohen put it down and the blood begin to congeal. Okay? Shachat Yisrael, an Israelite slaughtered the animal. The Kibel Kohen, and the Kohen then received the blood. Not no lechavero. He would handle the implement to his neighbor. V'chavero lechavero, and his neighbor to his neighbor. Mekabel et hamelo, and a Kohen would receive the full implement. Umachzir et harekan, and he would hand back an empty one. Kohen hakarov etzel hamizbeach, the Kohen who is closest to the altar, zorko zrika achat, he would sprinkle that blood, okay, with one sprinkling, keneged hayesod, against the base of the altar. Yatzta kat rishona, then the first group would leave. V'nechneset kat shniya, second group would enter. Yatzta shniya, nichnasa shlishit. Same procedure, second group would leave, third group would enter. Okay? K'ma'aseh harishona, kach ma'aseh hashniya v'hashlishit. So the way they did for the first group, so they did for the second group and the third group. Okay? Karu et ha'halel. And while they were doing this, they were reciting the Hallel. Now, there is some difference of opinion, just to let you know, between Tosafot and Rashi. Okay, whether they recited according to Rashi the regular Hallel, Psalms 113 to 118, or according to Tosafot, they recited that plus the Hallel Gadol, Psalm 136, or they instead or in addition to. Okay. Now, im gamru, if they finished recitation of the Hallel, shanu, they repeated it a second time. V'im shanu shlishu. If they repeated it a second time, they did it a third time. Afal pi shalosh shlishu miyamehim. Even though they never really finished the third time whatsoever. Now, Rabbi Yehuda Omer says, Miyameim shel kat shlishit lo higiu. Generally, the third group never reached to the point in the Hallel until they got to where it said, Lo ahavti ki yishma Hashem, okay, that they got that far, mepnei sha'ama mu'atim. Why? Because the number of people were so small in the third group. Okay. Now, our Mishnah, however, tells us an important, not that the other wasn't important, but another important piece of information, namely, K'ma'asehu b'chol, the same way they carried out the slaughter and the blood, everything, on a weekday, Kach ma'asehu b'Shabbat. So likewise, they carried it out on Shabbos. However, the Mishnah then adds, Ela shehakohanim medichim et ha'azara shelo b'rtzon chachamim. That the Kohanim allowed water to come up onto the floor of the Azara, okay, to wash away the excess blood, even though the sages were not happy about that. Now, Rabbi Yehuda Omer, according to Rabbi Yehuda, Kos hayam mimale midam hata'arovet, that the Kohen, okay, would bend down and scoop up some of the blood that was on the floor of the Azara, okay, as well. And they would mix that mixed blood from the various offerings. Zarkozrika, they would also sprinkle that. Echat al gabei hamizbeach, okay? They would sprinkle it once again against the altar. Velo hodu lo chachamim. But the sages also weren't happy with that. Now, says the Gemara, the Mishnah, going on. Ketzad tolin umafshitin. How did they now hang the bodies of the Korban Pesach and flay the bodies? Okay? So the Gemara, the Mishnah tells us, unkalios shel barzel, that there were iron hooks, okay, that were into hayu kfuim b'klim uba'amudim, that were attached to the walls and to the pillars in the Azara, shebahem tolin umafshitin, that they would hang the animal body on those hooks and they would flay them. Kol mi she'en lo makom litlot v'lahafshit, and any of the Kohanim that did not have access to a hook, what would they do? Maklot dakim b'chalakim, that they had metal rods that were thin and they were smooth. Hayu sam maniach al ktefo, and they would put one on the shoulders of two kohanim, va'al ketef chavero, and they put another metal rod on the shoulder of another of his colleague kohen, and then they would put the animal on top, right? V'toleh umafshit, and they would hang the animal from those rods and flay them. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, he coined to Rabbi Eliezer, okay? Namely, on a situation where Yud Daled Shecha Liot B'Shabbat, as we turn over, when the 14th came out on a Shabbos, Maniach Yado al Katef Chavero, V'yad Chavero al Ktefo. They did not use those metal rods, but each Kohen put an arm on his colleague's shoulder, okay? V'toleh umafshit, and they would hang the animal from their arms, and they would flay the animal with their other hand. Okay? Now, what would happen? Karo, they would tear and cut the animal open, v'hotziat emurav, and they would remove those portions, the fat, the kidneys, things like that, that were to be burnt on the altar. Netano b'magis, they would put it inside a basin, v'hiktiran al gabei hamizbeach, and they would burn it up, offer it on the altar. Now, yatzta kat harishona, when we say that the first group exited, v'yashva la bahar habayit, they would then go out and they would remain on the Temple Mount within the, right? Shniya b'chayil, okay? The second group, when they would go out, they would remain inside the chayil, inside the, what I'm going to call the step portion between a lower fence and the azara, the steps, right? V'hashlishit, and the third group, bimkoma omeret, would remain standing in the azara itself. Okay? Some discussion could ensue about the fact that the other two groups, groups 1 and 2, where they went out, it was actually permissible to sit, but those third group did not have that option, and they required standing. Okay? Now, how long did they stay? Chashecha, until dark, yatzu v'tzalu et pischehem. Then they went out and they went home, it would appear, and roasted their Korban Pesach. So that's why I say that could have answered Zev's question, okay? As the fact that the animal and the imurim were slaughtered and brought in the temple, but then people roasted their own. Okay, now let's go into the Gemara. Gemara is going to have a lot here to say. All right, Amar Rabbi Yitzchak, Ein ha-Pesach nishchat ela b'shalosh kitot shel shloshim b'nei adam. According to Rabbi Yitzchak, the Korban Pesach could not be slaughtered unless you had each group, okay, have 30 individuals in it. My Tama, what would be the reasoning? Because the Pasuk said, Kahal, Ve'eda, V'Yisrael, 3 different groups. So do you have 10 in each group? That gives a total of 30? Or do you have 30 in each group, which gives you a total of 90? Gemara continues. Misfekelan, it was questionable for us. I bevat echat, if they came in all at one time. I bezeh achar zeh, if it was done one after another. Hilkach, therefore, ba'inen shalosh kitot shel shloshim. Shloshim b'nei Adam. Therefore, we needed 3 groups of 30 people. Okay? De'i bavat echat, because if then it was intended to be all at one time, ha'ika, therefore we have it. Ve'i bazeh achar zeh, and if it's one after another, ha'ika, here too we have it. Okay? Hilkach, therefore, says the Gemara, b'chamshin, if we have 50 people, nami sagya, even that is enough. Da'ile tlatin va'avde, because 30 can come in and they act. Aile asara, 10 will leave. 10 more will come. V'nafke asara, and 10 leave. Aile asara, v'nafke asara. 10 more would come and 10 would leave. So the minimum would be making sure that at least 50 were there. Okay, now coming back, Nichnesa kat rishona, the first group entered. Okay? Itmar, about this, the following was said. Abaye, okay, was under the impression that our Mishnah said, Amar nin alu, that the gates closed on their own. Okay? In other words, a miracle occurred. Tnan Rabba, that was what was taught. Rabba Amar, says Rabba, no alin Tanan. No, says Rabba, the Mishnah was worded that they closed the gates. My benaihu, what's the difference between them? Ika benaihu, the mismach anisa. The difference between them was whether or not they relied on the miracle. Of course, the idea was that miracles were frequent inside the Azara, right? Now, Abai Amar Nin'alu Tanan. Abai said the language of the Mishnah was that it was closed on its own. Kama da'ailu, as those who came in, ma'alu, they entered, v'samchinan anisa, and we relied on a miracle that the gates would close. Rabba Amar, says Rabba, no alin tanan, that our Mishnah taught it was closed. V'lo samchinan anisa, and we don't rely on a miracle. But the Gemara says, Vaha, and in this case, the Tnan wasn't it taught, Amar Rabbi Yehuda, that Rabbi Yehuda said, okay, the following, Chas v'shalom, okay, it's God forbid, so to speak, she'akavia ben Mahalel nitnada, that someone like Akavia ben Mahalel would be banned. She'ein azara nin'elet al kol adam b'Yisrael b'chachma u'b'yira'at chet ke'Akavia ben Mahalel. Okay, that the gates of the Azara would not close on any individual who had the level of wisdom and Yiras Shamayim, let's say, as did Akavia ben Mahalel. Okay? And therefore, Abaye mitaretz l'ta'ameh. Abaye therefore has an explanation for his reason. V'Rabba mitaretz l'ta'ameh. And Rabba has an explanation for his reason. Abaye mitaretz l'ta'ameh. Abaye explained his reasoning. Ein ba'azara b'sha'a shenin Allah al kol adam b'Yisrael b'chachma u'v'yirat shchet ka'akavia ben Mahalel. That you do not have the gates of the Azara close on any individual that has the level of wisdom and Yiras Shamayim as Akavia ben Mahalel. Rabba mitaretz l'ta'ameh. Rabba explains his reasoning. Ein ba'azara b'sha'a sheno'alin ota al kol Yisrael b'chachma u'b'yirat chet ke'akavya ben Mahalalel. That according to Rava, they don't close the gates when there are people inside who might have the level of wisdom and yiras chet, as did Akavya ben Mahalel. Okay. Now, we're going to get to a couple of digressions as the Gemara continues, but they're digressions in association with this idea of, number one, how crowded could it have gotten when they were doing the Korban Pesach, and how many people could there have been there for the whole ritual, let's say, for the whole practice of carrying out this Korban Pesach on the holiday. So the first Braita, okay, that's a bit of a digression. Tanu Rabbanan, says the Braita. Rabbis taught, Me'olam lo nitma'ach adam ba'azara. It would never occurred that a person got crushed in the temple courtyard, chutz mi Pesach echad, except on one particular Pesach, shahaya b'yamei Hillel, that occurred during the time of Hillel, shenitma'ach bo zaken echad, that an older male got crushed, v'hayu korinoto Pesach me'uchin, and therefore they remembered it and called it the crushed Pesach. Second Braita, again digression. Pa'am achat, one time, bikesh Agrippus HaMelech, King Agrippus the First, okay, who was the king, excuse me, wanted to know, litain enav be'ichluse Yisrael. He wanted to know I'm going to say the population of the Jewish people. Okay? Remember, there was always question of whether counting the community, even from referred to in the Tanakh, okay, whether that was appropriate. So Amar Le, he said, the Kohen Gadol, to the Kohen Gadol, Tein einech b'psachim, put your, in other words, give an eye, in other words, take a strong look at Pesach time. In other words, when they do the Korban Pesach, Natal kuya mikol echad, take one kidney from each Korban Pesach. V'neimtza sham, nimtza'u sham, shishim ribo zugei klayot. And it turned out that there were, what? 60,000 pairs of kidneys. Kiflayim kiyotzei mitzrayim, twice as many as those went out of Egypt.
600,000.
What? 600,000. Yeah. Okay. All right. Twice as many. So what happened? That did not include, says this statement, chutz mitameh, with the exception of those who were tameh, v'shahaya b'derech rechoka, or those that did not include those who were too far away. Okay. Now the Gemara says, ve'ein lecha kol pesach u'pesach shelo nimnu alav yoter me'asara b'nei adam. And you did not have any Korban Pesach where you wouldn't have had a minimum of 10 people registered for it. Okay, so if you had X number of kidneys, you'd have to multiply that, right? Now, but the Gemara says, V'hayu kor'in oto Pesach me'uvin. And they used to call that occasion the crowded Pesach. Okay, so the Gemara asks on that story, Natal Kuya, could the Kohen Gadol really have taken a kidney? After all, isn't that part of the Imurim, right? By Aktorah, isn't it necessary for it to be offered up, to be burnt? So the Gemara answers, Dahadar maktalahu, that afterwards he burnt it. But the Gemara challenges, Vahakativ vehiktiro, but isn't it written, it must be burnt up? Okay? Shalo ya'arev chalevav shel zeh bazeh, that you don't mix the fats. I'm going to read that as actually emurim, the appropriate sacrificial parts of one sacrifice with another. So the Gemara answers, Dahadar maktir laho chada chada, that he went and afterwards burnt it up one kidney at a time. Vahatanya. But again, the Gemara challenges, but isn't it taught elsewhere in a Braita? Vihiktiram, and it says you burn them, namely, sheyehe kulo ke'echad, namely that all the emurim must be burnt at the same time. Ella tfisa ba'alma. Okay, but rather what we're saying here, that when the Kohen took it, it was only what I'll call a momentary seizure. In other words, he grabbed it momentarily, the shakil minayu, and held on to it, right? Adi havinan le mide acharina, until they brought him something else that he could use as a actual item for counting. They put a stone there, a pebble or something, okay? Now, going on, back to our Mishnah. Kohanim omdim shurot v'chulei. We said the Kohanim stood in rows, right? Ma'itama, what was the reasoning, right? Ilema dilma shakle dadahava uma'ale de kaspa. If we're saying that it's because they could take something that was gold and bring instead something that was silver, Hachanami here too. Dilma shakle bar matan, umaile bar mea. Here too, they could perhaps take something that was worth 200 and replace it with something worth 100. Ela dahachi shapir tfei. No, but they did it because it was more beautiful. Okay, it looked nicer. All the silver in one row, all the gold in another row. Next part from our Mishnah. V'lo hayu b'lezavichin shulayim. It said that the utensils did not have flat bottoms. Tanu Rabbanan, says a Braita. Kol havizichin shebamikdash lo hayu lahen shulayim. All of these utensils in the Beis HaMikdash did not have, okay, a flat bottom. Chutz mi'uvizichei levona shel lechem hapanim, with the exception of those particular utensils that were used for the Shabbos showbread. Shema yenichum v'yifros halechem, lest one Kohen put them down and it start to crumble the bread. Shachat Yisrael v'kibel haKohen. Okay, says the Gemara. Lo sagya delav Yisrael. It's not enough that it said an Israelite slaughtered. He gufa. Okay, this comes itself. Kamash malan the shchita bazar kshera, that a slaughter by a non-Kohen is acceptable. Okay, but then it says v'kibel haKohen, that the Kohen received hakamash malan, coming to teach us mikabala ve'elech mitzvat kahuna. From receiving the blood onward, it is the commandment of the Kohen. Not no lechavero, said our Mishnah. He gives it to his colleague. Shamat mina holacha shalo beregel havya holacha. From here we learn that the transmission of the blood does not have to be by foot, okay? Walking it over, okay? In other words, they could pass it. Dilmahu miyed purta. Perhaps he could make just a little step, a little movement. Ve'elamai kamashmalan. What does it then come to teach us? HaKamashmalan barav am hadrat melech. Namely, it teaches us that the more Kohanim were involved, the greater the idea of the mitzvah. And therefore, whenever we have more people involved in a mitzvah, the better. Kibel et hamalo umachzir et rekan. He received the full and passed on, returned the empty. Aval ipchalo, but the opposite no. Messiah, and this idea supports the view of Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, the Amar Reish Lakish, who says, Ein ma'averin al hamitzvot, that we don't pass over the opportunity to do a mitzvah. Kohen akarov etzel hamizbeach, the Kohen closest to the mizbeach. Man Tana Pasach Bezrika. So who is the Tana then who says that the blood of the Korban Pesach was sprinkled? Amar Rav Chisda, says Rav Chisda, Rabbi Yossi Haglili. That's what was. Rabbi Yossi Haglili, Titania, who teaches Rabbi Yossi Haglili, says, Et damam tizrok al hamizbeach, ve'et chelvam taktir. And their bloods will be sprinkled on the altar, and their fats offered. Damo lo ne'amar. Its blood was not said. Ela damam, their blood. Chelvo lo ne'amar. Ela chelban. Not its blood, but their bloods. Lamed al bechor umaaser upesach. It teaches us that on the firstborn offering, on a tithe offering and a korban pesach, shehem te'unin matan damim, that they require, right, the putting of the bloods, ve'emurim, and the offerings, legabe hamizbeach, towards the altar. Minalan de te'unim yesod, but how do we know that it has to be towards the base? Amar Rabbi Elazar, says Rabbi Zelim, atya zrika ma'ola. Why? Because it says here, when it says zrika, we mean a better, a full, complete zrika. K'tiv hacha et damam tizrok, because it's written there, their bloods you shall sprinkle, al hamizbeach. Uk'tiv hatam, and it's written elsewhere, v'zarku b'nei Aharon hakohanim, et damo al hamizbeach saviv. Okay, says that the Kohanim sprinkled the blood on the altar. Ma'olah te'una yesod, the same way the korban olah requires its blood to be sprinkled on the base. Af pesach nami ta'un yesod. So likewise, the korban pesach requires its blood to be sprinkled on the base. And we'll just continue a tiny bit on the top of Samach Hey. V'olah gufa minalan, and the olah itself. How do we know that that's the case? Amar Kra, because the pasuk says, El Yesod Mizbach HaOlah, okay, to the base of the altar, the olah. Alma, from this we therefore learn, we sort of gather olah te'una yesod, that the olah requires its blood sprinkled on the yesod. And we'll stop right there today. Okay? And we'll pick up tomorrow as the Gemara continues to tell us about the different groups. Okay?
Rabbi.
Yes.